So for the first theme, it's a definition of common workflows, patterns, and benchmarks. And it's going to be led by Dan Lenny from Lawrence Livermore and Dorran Howell from Tweag.
Thanks. Yeah, so the motivation of this area is it comes out of the initial report, which is that it's hard for users to select and adopt a workflow tool, and it's hard for them to compare the technological capabilities of the tools. And it's also true that a lot of the systems have common technology and patterns that potentially can be exploited to make it easier for people to transition between tools and select them. So for this breakout, the goal is to identify some concrete steps to basically identify these common patterns and create examples, which is one of the short-term goals from one of the breakout sessions in the previous meeting. Identify the key terminologies and attempt to come to some ground on that. And that's been attempted many times. So I'm not entirely sure we'll solve that today, but the idea of common patterns implies some common nomenclature for being able to navigate them. And then formulate an approach for building these examples and benchmarks and identify existing work in this area. Because I know that at the previous meeting, there were people that are building portals and examples and attempting to do this sort of collection of workflow motifs. So I think we want to not reinvent the wheel there, but hopefully in our breakout, we will have those folks present and we can sort of build on existing work. And so I wanted to remind folks of some of the key findings from the prior meeting, and I'm also putting those into the notes for the breakout as well. The first thing was out of theme 2 was in the training and education theme. It really was the fact that these patterns are kind of spread around. Each system has a few patterns they put on in their documentation or in some of their examples, but there's not an easy way for users to really understand the space, especially users that don't know about workflows as a technology, right? They tend to not have potentially a lot of time to really understand the technological trade-offs between systems. For AI, a lot of that community would like to see workflows in AI be developed as benchmarks as well, as in sort of to augment the classical, sort of DAG of simulation models that we all know and love. And for the exascale, it really is about mini apps and benchmarks, the ability to understand the scaling properties of workflow tools. That's another key thing. And then there's another concern, which is AI or API interoperability and standards. And so I think our area is focused on the benchmarks and common motifs, but part of that really hopefully will fall out is starting to understand some of those places where there's commonality in how workflows are specified, the concepts in the systems, places where the community can sort of create more commonality and more interoperability moving forward. So those are the key findings, and we're looking forward to hopefully an active breakout. Our goal is to try to get the community to come in and provide a lot of ideas and help us start figuring out how we might all approach this problem and make some progress, especially on the examples and training and making it easier for users to select, adopt, assess workflow systems. That's it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. You have a question actually on the chat from Dan Katz that is asking, is the common element on patterns in the workflows themselves or assumptions in the workflow management system?
Oh, I guess I was thinking of it in terms of the patterns themselves, not the systems. In other words, for users, I don't know if they necessarily think, well, I could be wrong about this, but in my estimation, they tend to think of the patterns in their tools and not necessarily, and then maybe how to map it to the systems. But that's a good topic, and I think I'm going to put a note in our breakout to maybe think about that, because I hadn't really considered that. So thank you.
Yeah, just really quickly, the reason I was asking that is that the theme 5 piece is much more on the workflow management systems, but the title of this new theme 1 is on the workflows themselves, and it wasn't clear to me if this was one or both.
I feel like we're going to probably focus on the first three themes, But I put theme 5 in there because it did seem related. So much of the stuff is interconnected. So I didn't want us to forget about the fact that there was a lot of discussion about sort of common denominators, which is what, in my mind, I'm thinking benchmarks is one vehicle for being able to see the same workflow expressed in different contexts and different systems, different user interfaces and APIs. And so that's kind of what I was thinking would be related. But I kind of think that for this work breakout, unless people want to, that we should focus on the training examples and motifs part of it and have this theme 5 aspect hopefully kind of fall out of that discussion. Does that make sense? And I'm open to other views on that.
So cool. So yeah, thanks again to everyone for participating in this breakout session. It was really interesting. We had a lot of great discussion. This is actually quite a complex topic, as it turns out, because it's really challenging to define, the guiding examples to have for kind of making it easier for new users to onboard with all the many different workflow systems that there are. One of the things that we discussed was really in terms of documentation and examples, which was sort of the main focus or the main kind of inspiration for our session, was who that material should be targeted towards. So whether it should be targeted towards kind of prospective users, so for example, a data scientist or a researcher, or workflow developers, or people looking to benchmark workflow systems. And so in the end, we felt that the existing documentation for various workflow tools tends to be focused on kind of simple examples and doesn't really provide full complex examples that a user might need to really get started with one of their really concrete specific problems that they're working on. And so as a goal coming out of this session, we defined a milestone to be that we wanted to, so for our suite of example workflows, which we'd like to define, we would like to target those towards more the end user, so the data scientist or the researcher, and not just, for example, a workflow developer. The idea being that they cover a broad number of individual use cases, so they're not overly specific, but they're complex enough to allow someone to tackle real-world tasks. And so that's all a bit abstract, and I think in the end, our session overall led to a lot of questions, which we weren't able to answer in the amount of time that we had, but I think they're great questions. I think we were able to progress this discussion forward a bit, and so in the end, when it comes to the specifics of what these examples should be, there are a lot of questions around sort of how abstract they should be. So should they really focus purely on, the logic of kind of linking together the different pieces in the workflow, or should they include sort of the real world logistics and nitty gritty details of, file management and IO and all these different details which a user is going to encounter immediately whenever they actually try and do something in the real world. And as a part of that, a question that we have is, is it possible to define examples with that in mind that can be run in an HPC and a cloud environment? Or do we need to kind of define separate examples and kind of standard use cases for HPC and cloud environments, which would then be implemented separately? And so that's an open question we have that we still would like to address. Just going through the list here again, one of the things that we discussed is if we have sort of a common structure for workflows, for our example workflows, it might be possible to use some type of tool, I believe Skeleton was mentioned, for sort of automatically generating sort of kind of mock test workflows, if you will, that aren't relying on sort of domain-specific packages or anything like that, but will provide a user of examples of reading from files, doing I/O, and doing performance or resource-intensive tasks. And then that type of sort of approach would also allow for more easy benchmarking between different workflow systems using these kind of standard suite of examples. And yeah, and so then in the end, we had this milestone or goal of sort of coming up with a set of standards. Ideally, then these could be hosted somewhere in some type of central repository or website or you know, some type of central place just to put all these things. And you know, I don't think we came to a conclusion for where that should be, but it would be, it will need to exist somewhere. I think that's most of what we had discussed.